say something very just quickly. My name is Rob Mann. I'm a associate professor of anthropology at St. Cloud State University. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm getting pretty good at talking through a mask. I do it quite often now at St. Cloud State, but if I need to speak up, just let me know. I can do that. I'm in my 8th year now at St. Cloud State University in the Department of Anthropology. 8th or 9th. I'm losing track now with the pandemic. But I came here from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I have been there for almost 13 years. I'm an archaeologist. I'm also from the Midwest originally. My background and research interests are in the fur trade. So being in Minnesota is like coming home, right? There's so much work to do here. I've been very fortunate to work in a great department. We have a great undergraduate program, and we also have a graduate program in cultural resources management archaeology. And I teach primarily to our graduate students and mentor graduate students through their master's thesis projects in cultural resource management archaeology. Mary was very kind to invite me to give a talk tonight, to give an update on some of the work that I've been doing. Since I've been in the state, it seems like Morrison County has been my second home for the research that I've been doing. Almost all of the archaeology that I've done since I've been in Minnesota has been in Morrison County. In part because of the Douglas A. Birk connection and the Birk, what I'll talk about today, the Birk collection. And I think with that, maybe we can move on into the talk.
Yeah.
Does that sound good? Please. All right. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the archaeology that I've done in the last year or so here in Morrison County, and also give an update on where we are with the Douglas A. Birk collection, which is now housed in the Department of Anthropology at St. Cloud State University. And of course the train's going to come right now. Thank you, Anne-Marie. We can go on to the next slide, I think. So tonight what I'd like to do is talk about these 3 different things. Begin with where we are with a project that is currently being funded by the Minnesota Historical Society, the Legacy Amendment monies, the grants that you can get through that program, to archive and curate the Douglas A. Birk collection. We'll talk a little bit about what that means and where we are. It's currently ongoing and will be wrapping up in the spring of next year. Then I'd like to talk secondly about some of the archaeology that I've done recently here in Morrison County as part of our 2020 Archaeological Field School, and I'll talk a little bit about how that came about. And then finally, sort of jumping back to the Birk collection a little bit, I've also had a grant over the last year and a half or so to look at a portion of the artifacts from the MO20 collection. I'll talk about what that means as well. That's part of the Birk collection, to look at the ceramics in particular, the pottery that came off of that 18th century site here in Minnesota, and some of the implications of what that pottery might be telling us about who was there at MO20 sometime in the middle to late part of the 1700s. Next slide. Okay, so I wasn't sure how much background that I might need to go into. I'm going to assume that most people in the room have some idea of who Doug Birk was and what Doug Birk did, or should I give a little bit of...
I give a little bit of background.
Just a little bit of background. So that is Doug there. Here's a little bit about Doug. We could go on all night about what Doug did for the state of Minnesota in archaeology, but he was an archaeologist here in Minnesota for many decades, long career. He was among the first archaeologists to conduct underwater investigations of sites related to the fur trade on the Voyageurs Highway in the northern part of Minnesota, looking at canoe wreck sites. These drowned canoe wreck sites. They figured out back in the late 1960s and early 1970s that they could actually dive in those rapids or below those rapids and find evidence of these canoe wrecks that occurred during the height of the fur trade here in this part of the world. So that was instrumental in some of that very cutting edge, very progressive kinds of archaeology in this part of the world at that time. He was also importantly importantly, a co-founder of the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology. It was a nonprofit for most of its life. It was a not-for-profit organization dedicated to doing archaeology in Minnesota. There are very few institutions like this, even today, and so it was groundbreaking, and it was very important, and it was an extremely positive event and organization for helping archaeologists to better understand the archaeological past of Minnesota. And so Doug was a foundational member of that institution. And then, importantly, for what I'm going to talk about here tonight, he also, throughout the 1980s, led the excavations at a really important 18th century site here in Morrison County known as MO20. That designation is part of a trinomial system that archaeologists use to identify archaeological sites. So its full name is 21 MO20. It's been abbreviated to MO20. What it really means is that it was the 20th site recorded by the state of Minnesota in Morrison County, right? So MO20 just represents that. My connection to all of this is that as a graduate student, I was working on my PhD at the State University of New York in Binghamton back in the 1990s. I was digging, excavating a 19th century fur trading post on the Wabash River. I had done my master's on that site a few years earlier in the early 90s. This was the mid to late 90s. So I was very familiar with Doug's work because he'd already been doing this kind of stuff since the 70s, basically, late 60s, early 70s. So there was a very odd and fortunate for me connection between the IMA, the Institute for Minnesota Archaeology, and the site that I was working on. I won't go into that history, but anyway, it led to Doug and I making a connection. And the IMA actually sponsored, we had a large grant, and IMA administered the grant that we had to do this work in Indiana, believe it or not. Ask me after the talk, I'll give you all the details. It's a really convoluted story and interesting. Doug actually came down to Indiana and spent a week with me on the site setting up a water screen system that he had been using at MO20 for all those years in the 1980s. Of course, I knew all of that because I had read everything that Doug had written about the work that he had done at MO20, and it was the sort of a guiding, a foundational document for what I wanted to do at this site for my dissertation. So that was my introduction to Doug. We met, we stayed in touch off and on for the next 10 years or so. I went off and finished my degree and ended up down in Louisiana. Doug came back to Minnesota and continued to work here. And then in 2013, I showed up in Minnesota, and the first person, literally, that I called from my office at St. Cloud State was Doug. And I found Doug through the Morrison County Historical Society because the website has a page dedicated to Doug and his work. And so I reconnected with Doug in 2013, which was fantastic. We were making plans to continue working together and to collaborate on research projects, and Doug was interested in helping out our graduate students in our program that I talked about, the CRM Archaeology. We were going to set up internships. We had all kinds of plans for what we were going to be able to do, and unfortunately it didn't come to pass because Doug passed away. And that left a big void in Minnesota archaeology, a huge void. Then, as a result of that tragic incident, we were very fortunate, in conjunction with Linda, who's here tonight, and Morrison County Historical Society, to be able to bring Doug's life's work to St. Cloud State University. That's the Douglas A. Birk collection. So if we can go on to the next slide. It consists of Doug's incredible personal research library that he had collected over the course of his entire career and beyond, going all the way back to his childhood days. We have it all. We have the entire collection, and it is an amazing resource. Now, every professor that I know has a bookcase or 2 or 3 or maybe 4. Doug had 19 bookcases full of books in his library. That's the scope and the scale of this research library. It's all now at St. Cloud State, so that was one component of the collection. We have Doug's professional papers. All of the work, all of the notes that he had taken, all of the research that he had done on various sites, various artifacts, types of artifacts, various topics like the missionization period in Minnesota, the fur trade, obviously, railroads, early transportation systems, the early settlement of Minnesota. All of that is incorporated in Birk's professional papers. And then, importantly, and we'll get back to this later on this evening as well, we actually have the material culture, the artifacts, and other remains that were collected from those excavation years in the 1990s at the 21M020 archaeological site. So those are the 3 components of the Birk collection as they now exist at St. Cloud State University. In 2019, we were able to secure that legacy amendment grant that I was talking about through the Minnesota Historical Society to, we can go on to the next slide, I think, to curate and archive the Birk collection. So these are the goals that we had set up in that grant. We wanted to first find the physical space. If you've ever been on a campus, on a university, or ever worked at one, space is a rare commodity. Like, everybody is always jostling for space. Is that room empty? Whose is it? Can I have it? So we had to first find a place to put all of this stuff. So we had to set up the physical spaces at SCSU that serve now as the permanent library and laboratory space and the permanent archival and curation space for the Birk collection. And that took some doing. It took some negotiations with other departments. It took some muscle from our dean, quite frankly, to help this all along. But we now have 2 wonderful spaces, and I'll show you those in just a moment. Another goal was to process the paper archive, all of those documents that we talked about that were a part of Doug's professional papers, and to create a finding aid for this portion of the collection so that other researchers can have access to it. That was a huge part of this grant. And then finally, well, not finally, but the other large part of this grant was to rehouse or rebag, essentially, repackage all of the artifacts that had been stored in boxes since they had basically been excavated out of the ground in the 1980s. This is an ongoing part of the project. And then finally, the other thing that we wanted to make sure that we were doing is, if we were going to set these spaces up, we wanted to make sure that they met at least some basic standards for curation space and archival space. That is, make sure that the temperature and the humidity were correct, and make sure that we're keeping pests down to a minimum and keeping those kinds of things out of the spaces where the collection now rests. So we have set up some environmental monitoring devices to help us to do that. Go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is what we have. We have 2 rooms. If you're familiar with St. Cloud State, we're in Stewart Hall. If you've ever been to Stewart Hall, it's where Rishi Auditorium is. So I know that they have public events that take place there, so some of you might have been in Rishi Auditorium, which is over here. This is the auditorium space here. And then up on the 2nd floor, we have these 2 spaces here. And it really was a process of negotiation. Those spaces were occupied by another department. And departments don't like to give up space because you never know when you're going to get it back. But there was a little bit of trade-off here and there. It happened to be at a time when the university was also doing some things that were moving different departments and different programs into different remodeled spaces on campus. And so these 2 rooms became available to us. They're right across the hall from one another. I'm going to talk first about, I think, 212, which is the larger space, and then we'll talk a little bit about 211. So this is SH212. This is the library and laboratory space. We have tried to set up the library in much the same way that Doug had it organized on his shelves, with some modifications to make it fit more a university library system. So we have stuck to the basic categories of materials that he had, but there are some things that we've moved to make them more accessible for student research and things of that nature. This process is still ongoing. We still have some books that need to be shelved, but we're very close to having a functioning, working research library. This is a reference library, so you can't check books out. They cannot leave this room, but students and researchers can come in and access them and use them in this space. We also have part of Doug's research were what we call the gray literature in archaeology. These are reports written by archaeologists that are done sometimes because of federal laws that require archaeology to be done, or they're part of a research program at a particular site, like say Fort Michilimackinac in Michigan. So Doug had collected literally over 1,000 of those reports. I think we have something like 1,200 of these manuscript reports here in these cabinets here, along with a vertical file that are articles that Doug had written or articles that they photocopied, primary documents of journals and things that he had accumulated over the course of his career. It's a fabulous, unsurpassed, I think, for this part of the world, set of reference materials for archaeologists who are working in Minnesota on any of the kinds of things that Doug had an interest in. And then this is also our space for researchers to come who want to visit the Birk collection. So we now have two tables set up to house researchers, and then we keep the physical archives in the separate room. I'll show you in just a moment, and then we bring them in so that researchers can use those materials. We'll go on to the next slide. So this is right across the hall. This is SH211. This is the archives and curation room. This is where everything is permanently housed in these state-of-the-art curation cabinets that were purchased as part of this grant. These cabinets here house the archives, and these cabinets here curate the MO20 artifacts. We also have a computer, a printer, and a scanner that came from Doug's home office as well as a copy stand for doing high-quality photographs. This also came from Doug's personal materials in his home office. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the size and scope of this project. We hired probably, it's the best hire I've ever made. I hired an archivist. His name was Barrett Kodiak, and his resume was impressive, but I looked at a lot of resumes. I didn't know him. He was out west working, but we found him, and it was the best decision I had ever made, I think, in any professional career decision. He was fantastic. He took this mountain of boxes, just stuffed full of papers and documents and everything that you could imagine. And he did this. He laid it all out. He organized on the blackboard categories of information, and then he set about organizing it and controlling it and making sure that it all went in to its proper place. And then it's all sort of logically and orderly. We think that archaeologists are detail-oriented. He and I hit it off right immediately because archaeologists and archivists think alike. The most minute detail that you can think of has to be taken into consideration. You have to record everything. There has to be a paper trail for where everything went and how it got there. And Barrett did that for us. And we can go on to the next slide. So, over the course of several months, once he was finally able to come, this all happened he was supposed to be hired in April 1st of 2019. The university shut down April or March 13th, I think, of 2019. We were delayed by 4 months before we could finally bring Barrett in. So obviously that has set us behind, but he was able, by the end of 2020, by the end of 2020, he was able to take all of that and turn it into this. And so this is the archive as it currently exists. Each of these boxes contains the files, and each file contains all of the information organized by topic, by year, by relevance to each other, in a way that's incredibly useful for researchers who have any interest in the work that Doug Birk had done over the course of his long career. So, next slide. This was the end goal and the end product of Barrett's work. It's a finding aid. It's now available online through the St. Cloud State. It's hosted by the St. Cloud State Library. It's searchable. You can look for the subject terms. You can look for work files, subject files. There's an entire digital aspect to this. Is everything that was on Doug's personal computer related to his professional life. It's also accessible to researchers. They have to go through us, and we grant them permission to access that material. This has already generated a lot of buzz amongst researchers, not just archaeologists. In fact, most of the researchers that have come to visit the Birk collection so far have not been archaeologists. They've been historians, genealogists, people that are interested in this time period and these things, and they knew that Doug had information in his files that would help them in their research. So the finding aid has been fantastic. It's gone live. It's out there and available for anybody who would like to use it. Next slide. Okay, so that was one part of the grant. Remember, so we did the physical spaces. We have archived the professional papers. And the last part, well, the last big part of the grant again, was to curate the MO20 materials. So Doug had been working on these artifacts for many, many years after they had been excavated, but he had not completed a final report. So archaeologists, sometimes we're very slow. We often feel like we don't have enough information. Like if I just had a little more information, then I could write this report, then I could finish it. And so Doug had not written the final report for his excavations at 21 MO20. He had been working on it for many, many years, and the artifacts were all where they should be in bags that are labeled with their provenience information. But that was the 1980s. We're now in 2020. Archival or curation standards have changed over the years. Paper bags also, as you might imagine, after 20 or 30 years, they're not as in good a shape as they were when those materials were originally bagged up. And so part of our grant was to rehouse or rebag all of the MO20 collections using modern standards as put out by the Minnesota Historical Society. So we're using their curation standards to guide our practice with the MO20 artifacts. So these are just some examples. So we would have a bag with an artifact and a tag inside a paper bag. And what we have done, if we can go on to the next slide, is we've kept all of that information, but we have organized it. We organized all of the bags first. We have a handwritten specimen catalog that Doug and his co-workers did back in the 1980s and I think into the early 1990s. And then we have all of this is the MHS curation standards for archaeological collections. Next slide. We have rehoused all of that material into, these are our standard plastic bags, 3 or 4 mil thick. These are the standards that are put out by the Minnesota Historical Society. With all of that information, all that provenience information, where did this all come from, what's in here, how many, and then ordered into these curation cabinets. And that's the part that's still ongoing. The pandemic slowed us down, so we had to finish up the archival part first, and then we moved on to the curation part. But we're getting there. We're starting to fill these cabinets up. I have a graduate student who's currently working on this project. Our grant was extended through the end of May of next year because of COVID, so we still have some time to get this all put together. But next slide. But that is the biggest bulk of the work that we've done so far in getting the Birk collection both archived and curated. I mentioned environmental monitoring. That was another thing that we take very seriously. So Baird helped set this up for us. We have a monitoring device that we keep in one of the cabinets there in the archive and curation room. It monitors things like temperature, humidity, sunlight, I don't know, all of these little dots on the graph represent some variable that it's measuring. And every few weeks we go in and we generate a graph that shows all of that data. And it tells us, did we see a spike in the temperature? And sometimes we do. For whatever reason, right? There are lots of variables that can happen in a big building like that, but sometimes we'll see a spike in humidity or a spike in temperature. And we take note of that, and we log it all onto these logs that we have so that we can, if we ever would need to, we could go to the university and say, hey, there's something really weird going on in Stewart Hall. Can you help us? We don't have control of the HVAC systems in the building, right? But the university could, if they realized that, that something was happening, they could help us control for those variables, control the temperature, control the humidity, etc. We also have these test strips, traps that we put out across the different spaces that we have. And I've been really surprised. I have an office in this building, and I was like, oh my gosh, we don't eat in these rooms. We don't throw any trash away that would attract bugs. But I was just worried, that this is a building where a lot of people are, that we would have pest problems. We have 5 or 6 traps. We've caught like 3 spiders, and that's it. 3 little spiders, and that's all. Not a fly, not an ant. No, anything that would do any damage to any of the collections at all. So I've been very pleased about that. Our maintenance staff have been fantastic. They realize what's going on. They came to me. I didn't even know that they were going in. And they say, yeah, whenever we see a light on in there, we make sure that we go in that night and dump the trash. I had no idea that they were watching it that closely. Like, they knew when people were there and when people weren't there. And so they've been taking really good care of us as well. So that kind of takes care of, I think, the Birk collection. That's where we are. It is ongoing. My graduate student was in today rehousing the beads from the collection. And we have lots and lots of tiny glass beads that were excavated from the 21 and 120 site.
Could you just stop for a moment and tell people where 21 M020 is? Just so they have a reference if they're not familiar.
Yeah, so actually, if you want to advance, we can skip through. Oh, I forgot one. Let me address this slide. I forgot. We are live. We are open right now to the public. And we have had about a dozen researchers, maybe more, who have already visited the Birk collection. These are a couple of archaeologists who've been working on some projects that overlap with sites and projects that Doug worked on in his career. They spent 2 days in the collection going over materials. We've had, as I said, genealogists, historians who've come and used the collection. Not only do we have researchers who come physically, we also prepare remote reference reports, and we have done, I think we've done 8 or 9, maybe 10 remote reference reports for people who will send us an email and say, I just heard about the Birk collection. Do you have anything related to X? And so myself or one of my students will go into the collection and look to see if we have material that's related to that topic or that person or that place or that site. And then we'll print out a report and let them know, yes, we have. We looked in these boxes and folders. Here's what we found. And then what our recommendations are. And very often our recommendations are, yes, we have stuff. We can't photocopy. We would spend all of our time and effort just photocopying stuff for people. But we recommend that they come and see us in person and visit us and get access to that material. So we do these remote reference reports. It slowed down during the summer And that's because all the archaeologists were out doing field work. Now that it's fall and heading into winter and the archaeologists will be back in their labs, this will pick back up again as they come to find that we have material that they're interested in. So I think that's the last slide with the collection stuff. Yes. So if you want to fast forward, I actually have a map.
Okay,
Just pretend like you didn't see any of this. It'll be brand new to you when we go back to it.
You got a lot of Louisiana in time.
Yeah. That was Ida was another big one. Yes, here it is. So so if you're familiar with the Little Elk Heritage Preserve, which is now part of Lindbergh State Park, MO20 is right here. I don't know if that's a good enough map to kind of give people, this is the Little Elk right here. This is the Mississippi River. I can't remember the name of this road, but Mary or somebody, you could.
Is it 213 or 13? And this, actually, the river that's out here is the Little Elk.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's very appropriate for us to be a thing on time.
We're right on it, yeah. So we're somewhere up here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, a few miles
So,
upstream.
yeah, this is only a couple miles north of Little Falls on the west side of the river.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, and so this all was part of, when we come back to this, I'll explain a little bit more, but the IMA was able to purchase, I believe there are 93 acres here that the IMA was able to purchase through the 80s, and it contains several archaeological sites, not just MO20, but MO20 is the jewel, right? It's the crown jewel of this, what was at the time an archaeological or heritage preserve, the Little Elk Heritage Preserve.
Yeah.
And so that's where all those materials came from.
And this map was drawn by Doug Birk.
Yep, right here.
So not only was he like this massively great archaeologist, he was really an artist.
He was a fantastic artist and cartographer, making maps, fantastic maps as well. So yes.
Okay. So you want me to go back?
Yeah, let's go back.
All right.
We'll save this one for the very end. Okay, so
And I think that's it.
2020, yes, I think that is it. 2020, we teach an archaeological field school because we have a program in anthropology for our undergraduate students. And it is a required class. You have to take a field school. It doesn't have, we also teach on alternative years an ethnographic field school. It just happens that the even-numbered years are our archaeological field schools. So 2022, we'll be back out in the field doing archaeology. Hopefully here in Morrison County. More about that later. So summer of 2020, canceled, right? Shut down. The university was not allowing us to teach any classes. That's a problem for us because our students who need that class to graduate, what are they going to do? So we had to, on the fly, come up with an alternative set of classes for our undergraduate students to meet their degree requirements and to get the archaeological field training that they need to go get a job. You can, with a degree in anthropology and a field school, you can be hired as an entry-level archaeologist in the private sector archaeology world that's called cultural resource management. So this is what we came up with. In the fall of 2020, I taught a class called Archaeological Field Methods that had both a classroom component and a field component. Typically, our field schools are 6 weeks long, 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. So it's an intensive experience for the students. They come out every single day for 6 weeks and do archaeology. We couldn't replicate that in the fall because it's impossible with the way that students' classes and schedules work. So our alternative was that we had 6 weekends that we could come out, 6 Saturdays, in 3 different project areas here in Morrison County. And we didn't just do this willy-nilly. We had reasons to go where we went. So we developed the Morrison County Archaeological Survey Project, designed to locate and document previously unrecorded and previously recorded sites to update them. For each of these areas, we developed a research design with a set of research questions that we hope to answer in those locations. The focus of the field work was archaeological survey methods because we didn't have time to dig. Digging is very labor intensive. It takes a lot of time and effort. You can't do it a Saturday here and a Saturday there. That's not the way an archaeological excavation works. But the other part of being an archaeologist is how do you find sites? And that is what we call archaeological survey. And so we focused on those methods that we call pedestrian survey, which is just as it sounds, walking and looking for things, and shovel testing, which is digging these very small, controlled excavations over large spaces to see if there's anything buried in the ground. The rest of it is just technical stuff. We also had an analysis class that was ongoing with the research. So we would find something on Saturday, Monday morning we have it in the lab scrubbing it up with toothbrushes, right? So they were doing both of these things simultaneously, whereas typically we would do the field work in the summer and then they would do the lab work in the fall. Next slide. Okay, so the sites. Our first survey area was targeted in an effort to locate sites associated with the 19th century village of Belle Prairie, which I wasn't aware of until I started looking around at places to go do archaeology within, an hour, at least 45 minutes circumference of St. Cloud State, because our students, obviously, they have to get home at night. Many of them have families and jobs and all of those kinds of things, commitments. So my background, my interest is in the 19th century relations between French and French Canadian peoples and Native peoples and the Métis or mixed blood families that are often result from those relations. So I was really excited to learn about Belle Prairie and the large population of French Canadian peoples and Native peoples and Métis peoples who came to live here in the 19th century. Our second target was another spot here in Morrison County, the 19th century trading community of Aikinsville, established by William Aiken in 1848. He had a trading post there, he had a ferry on the river, he opened a hotel and other businesses, including a sawmill, a flour mill, and a grog shop. In 1856, it was renamed Swan River. There's a historical marker out there today. You can drive by and see it. I think you guys put it up, right? Is it?
Morrison County did.
Morrison County put it up.
Writing and that kind of thing.
The text on it and everything.
That's where it was.
Yeah. And, but it was gone by the 1880s. So that means it's an archaeological site now, right? If we can find evidence of where it was. And then our third target, also called Swan River in the name, Swan River Indian Village. Again, there's that trinomial, 21 MO. This was the 16th site recorded in Morrison County way back in the 1970s. Site was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983 by Doug Birk and Doug George, two young archaeologists at the time, in part because it was one of the few documented and identifiable locations of an Ojibwe village on the Mississippi. That caught my attention. That's my interest, right, is these historic connections between Native peoples and especially peoples involved in the fur trade. It was encountered in 1836 by Nicolay, who noted that it was a camp where the women and children stayed while the men were hunting in a nearby area, unquote. The National Register form also notes that the site has yielded much flaky debris and both brick and shell-tempered pottery. So lots of artifacts were there. And for the students, if you're going to teach students how to do archaeology, it's better to teach them on places where they're going to find some artifacts, because they get bored real quick otherwise. So that was another draw, right? That I knew that archaeologists had found stuff there, and that the chances are that we would find stuff there as well. Next slide. So, Belle Prairie. Very interesting place. I want to go back. I want to do more work there. I don't know exactly where yet or how or why, but like I said, I'll be teaching our field school in 2020. I have a real strong research interest in this place and what was going on there. There's a lot of stuff happening there in the 1840s, 50s, 60s, all the way through the turn of the 20th century. We were able to do, because we only had one Saturday, we had access to this property for one day. The family was great, but the farmer needed to be in his field the next week, and so if we could have gone back 2 weeks, it would have been fantastic. We could have done more work. But we had one day, one 8-hour day to do this. So we set up a pedestrian survey of a recently plowed field. That's the best condition that you can have for an archaeologist. Recently plowed means that the plow has dug up stuff that might have been buried, and it's right there on the surface, and you can see it. So we did this survey in the little yellow square box there. You see, if you go on to the next slide to see what I'm talking about. So the students are lined up on this field, 5 meters apart. They're each responsible for the row in front of them and the rows between them halfway over to each person. So as they're walking, they're doing this, right? Looking and looking. And they all have flags. And everywhere that you see a flag is a place where they found an artifact that was important enough to be flagged because it was something unique, or what we call diagnostic. It could tell us something about how old the site was or what kind of activities were going on. And all of those flags, then we shot in using a total station, a surveying instrument like you see on the side of the highway when they're building a road or constructing a bridge. So we shot in each of these points, and the students learned how to use this total station because it's a tool that all archaeologists need to know how to use. And then we also had a handheld GPS unit, and we took a GPS coordinate for each of those flags as well. And these are 2 of our graduate students who were taking the field school. They were fantastic because they had a little more experience. They were able to help the undergraduates understand this GPS mapping. They actually did a fantastic job going out and GPSing in each of these flags. So we not only had a map created by our total station, but we also could generate maps based on the GPS data. Next slide. What did we find? We found a site there. Believe it or not, as soon as we walked into the field, artifacts started showing up. And the farmer had no idea. Farmers don't really pay attention to that stuff unless it causes some problem, like it breaks a plow blade or something like that. And otherwise it just looks like trash. But to archaeologists, trash is it, right? That's what we are all about. Trash is what we find. So this is all debris from a 19th century farmstead that was here probably between about 1853, 55-ish, and probably was gone by about 1911. And so we found artifacts that date to that time period. Types of pottery. This is a type of yellowware. This is window glass. This is a bottle, a 19th century bottle neck and lips. Some amber glass. Lots of nails, of course. And what I thought was really interesting, a lot of yellow brick. If you're from this area, right, you realize there are a lot of yellow brick farmhouses all over this part of Minnesota. I think that's what stood there. It was a yellow brick farmhouse built sometime in the 1850s and gone sometime early in the 20th century. Certainly by the 1920s it was probably gone. Cast iron, that's from a cast iron kettle. And this is one of the most unique artifacts I think that I've found on any site. It's a 4-pronged fishing spear. 3 of the prongs have been busted off. I think they were busted off intentionally. I think they were doing something else with that spear after they weren't using it maybe as a muskrat spear. Because when I first saw it, that's what I thought. That's a muskrat spear. I don't know, maybe, but I don't think that 3 tines break off just like that. I mean, I could imagine if some of them were halfway broken, but they're all sort of snapped right down at the base. But it's a fishing spear, 4-pronged fishing spear. Very few of them have been found archaeologically, but there's quite a few of them in museums all over Minnesota, as you might imagine, fishing being what it is here in Minnesota. Native peoples were spear fishing long before Europeans got here. Some of their techniques were followed by European settlers, like dark house fishing or spotlight fishing from canoes at night. Whether or not this spear was used in that way, we don't know, but we certainly know that it was probably used in that capacity at some point. And then maybe it broke, or maybe it was modified to do something else, some other function that we're not aware of. This was probably the farmstead of Orrin A. Cole, who came to Minnesota in 1838. He probably settled in Belle Prairie by 1853 or 55. He and his family lived there for a number of years. He and his wife died in the early 20th century, and the family sells the property by 1911. The farm is probably gone, like I said, by 1920. We don't find any artifacts that date past about 1920. Right? Everything on this site that we find archaeologically sort of predates 1920. Next slide. So that was a brand new site, never recorded before in Minnesota. So it'll get a brand new site number, one of those trinomials, 21MO something. The site form hasn't been finished yet. This is Aikinsville Swan River. Again, we're doing this all on the fly. Thanks to Mary, I had some contacts who drove me around the area, and we happened to be out there looking around, and the property owner saw us and asked us what we were doing. And we told him, and he was like, oh, you want to dig on our land? Sure. You can bring, 15 kids and come and dig on my property. Are you kidding me? Yes, fantastic. So we did. Right here on this little strip of land, the marker is, correct me, is it somewhere over here? I can't see, but somewhere along this road, I believe. And I think that for the most part, the settlement, so this was the fair, there was a canoe landing here, this was probably the ferry landing as well, right down here. And I think that the Aikenville community was actually probably south of this T, where the roads T here. But we had access to this property, so that's where we looked. Another archaeologist had actually looked at that area back in 2001. They didn't do any subsurface testing like we did because they were doing a large survey, but what they found, eroding out of this sort of a cut bank here where the canoe landing comes in, they found some debris, stone debris for making stone tools that was eroding out of this landform. And so we decided that that would be a good place for us to look to see if there's buried archaeological deposits there. That was called the Blanchard Site I, actually. There's its number, 21MO182. And so we set up a grid over top of that area, and we excavated, again, we only had just one day at this site to work, 11 what we call shovel test pits. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our shovel test pits. Not a full-blown excavation. If you think of archaeology, most people think of big open squares where we're digging with little picks and brushes, and we do that. But in this case, this is mostly excavated with a shovel, straight down, about a foot by a foot square, as deep as we need to go to make sure that we have recovered any potential archaeological materials. In this case, we went all the way down to when we encountered glacial gravels, and we know there's nobody here in Minnesota before the glaciers came through, and so we stopped. We could dig deeper, but there's nothing archaeological down there. What did we find? Not that much. I was hoping we would find more, but we did find a few pieces of quartz. That's the largest, one of the largest pieces. It was probably what we call a core, used as raw material for making a stone tool. It's not a tool in and of itself, but it's the raw material for making a tool, where you would take it and knock smaller pieces off to either make a tool from that or to create a tool from the core itself. The 19th century Aikenville stuff, not very much. We found a couple of 19th century nails, square nails, but other than that, like I said, it seems like the 19th century community was south of where we were. Next slide. And then finally, we were able to spend 4 Saturdays at this site, the Swan River Indian site. And again, I just happened to know where this site was located. It's on the National Register, as I mentioned. It was put on by Doug Birk and Doug George back in the 1970s. And I was just driving it through the neighborhood, looking at my maps, looking at the roads, looking at the property. And I pulled into the driveway of this house, and I knocked on the door. Sometimes that's what you have to do. And I said, can we dig in your yard? And he was like, sure, you can come and dig in our yard. That was just amazing, right? Everybody is so cooperative. I told him about the site. He had no idea that he lived on an archaeological site. He and his family had been there for a few years, but they weren't aware of that. The site, however, the boundaries are actually a little bit north of where we were and focused on the river. So this part of the site was ill-defined, as was the southern part of the site. So what we were hoping to do was pick up evidence that this site, the Swan River Indian Village site that Nicolay says was occupied by Ojibwe women and children in the 1830s, we wanted to see if we could pick up evidence of that farther south here. So we were able to set up a larger grid in the wooded area there. And this is what was found by that previous survey that went through in 2001. They found 369 pieces of stone debitage, or tool-making stone, and some ceramics there as well. Next slide. So this is what we did. Again, we dug those shovel test pits. You've seen one, you've seen them all. This is a picture showing the students backfilling. Everywhere you see one of these flags, we also had a shovel test pit. Again, we found some evidence that that site was there. Not as much as I had hoped, and again, no evidence of that 19th century Ojibwe village. This is probably the coolest artifact that we pulled off of this site. It is a tool, or it was on its way to becoming a tool. It's called a biface. And that simply means that whoever was making it was turning it over from one side to the other as they were flint knapping it to create this object. It could have been a finished object. It could have been used as a knife or a scraper. But more likely, it was what we call a preform. Somebody was like preparing it. They were going to make something else out of it. Maybe they lost it, or they got left behind, and they never quite finished the job. So, but it's very well made on local cherts, and that was probably the highlight of the 22 STPs that we excavated at the Swan River Indian Village. So 6 Saturdays in the field. The students, they did fantastic. We had all kinds. We had them wear masks on site. We had a station set up with wipes and hand washing station. We had to all be, at lunch we had to be socially distanced. We had to take all of the COVID protocols and work out in the field. And they had never done this before, right? And some of them didn't know which end of the shovel you're supposed to use, right? And so they did a fantastic job under those conditions, right? Real archaeology is tough under the best conditions, but under these conditions, I was very proud of our students and how they handled everything. We had students who had to quarantine during this time period. We never knew from Saturday to Saturday who was going to be there, so you might have worked with one person for 3 Saturdays and now that person's gone. Your partner that you've been working with for all this time. So they did a fantastic job. They learned a lot of archaeological techniques. We found a lot of good archaeological materials under these less than ideal conditions. Next slide. And here they are. All of our students, as you can see, we're all masked up. This is hopefully the only crew picture that I'll ever take where you can't see the faces of the crew. Because of COVID, though, that's what we had to do. And 2 folks couldn't be there on that last day. But that was our 2020 Archaeological Field School. Acknowledgements. And if I left anybody out, I apologize in advance.